Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for coming to this session. So today we're going to be talking about, do potatoes have a place in a regenerative rotation? So I'd like to introduce our three speakers. So we've got Tom Storr from Dyson, Ben Taylor-Davies, who's a consultant in regenerative agriculture, and also Edward Bradley, who is equally an agronomist and a consultant in regenerative agriculture. So I'm here today as Richard Harding representing Groundswell Agronomy, and I'll also talk about some of the things that we've been doing around no-till potatoes on the farm. So I'm going to hand over to Tom to start with to talk about what they're doing at Dyson, and then we'll go through each presentation, and then at the end we'll open up for discussion and look forward to hearing your comments. So I'll hand over to Tom to start with.
Thank you. Yes, as Richard said, I'm Tom Storr, previously now at Dyson Farms, and been interested in cover crops, no-till and things like that. And I came here a few years ago and I saw the potatoes under straw and thought, how's that going to work in a predominantly combinable crop rotation? At Dyson Farms we grow a number of different crops: potatoes, sugar beet, binding peas, etc. A lot of forage crops, wheat, barley, etc. And we grow around 300 hectares of potatoes, so how do we do that more sustainably, using less cultivations, less fungicides, etc., less water. And so what I managed to do was talk to the farm managers and have a think about why we might want to do it. Can we maintain the improvements we've made elsewhere in the rotation? We're increasingly moving to reduced cultivations across the farm, reduced ploughing by 60% in the last couple of years alone. And most of our farms, 45% of the farms, have a cover or catch crop each year. So we're moving in that direction, but potatoes are a sticking point for us at parts of the rotation, depending on the soil type and where they are in the rotation. But there are a number of benefits that we'd like to see from it, including maintaining that soil improvement from cover crops and reduced cultivations, reduced time and cost potentially. Is there a benefit to pest and disease, and how would we go about measuring that? And also, can we plant in areas of the farm where we previously wouldn't have been able to plant, such as stony soils on the heathland? And so I think there's three things that regen potatoes look like for us at Dyson Farm: is reducing cultivations, mitigation of irrigation, and reduce the reliance on fungicides and blight sprays. Potentially it's something more to do with the breeding and the potato varieties that are available to us. So really for us it's the first two: how do we reduce cultivations and mitigate the irrigation? And so, having seen this potatoes under straw a couple of years ago here, twisted the farm manager's arm and we planted a small trial area. This is only 20 metres long, amongst 300 hectares. So we're really only having a look at it to see whether it would work from a practical point of view, because the biggest question I had was, how do we harvest these potatoes when I believe they were hand harvested several years ago here? And so we planted them under straw. You can see there the establishment of them, very patchy. We did suffer with pests, mice and slugs, severely reduced the germination and emergence. And generally they were about 3 weeks behind in terms of their growth stages compared to conventionally grown potatoes that were alongside them. So it provided some useful learnings to us. If we're going to do this on a commercial scale, or a lot bigger scale, we're going to have to most likely plant potatoes earlier. But the thing I should say is that these potatoes planted by hand receive no seedbed nitrogen either. And this is what we have in a bet with the potato planter guy. He said I'd never get him a bag of potatoes, and I managed to do that. So, and we performed quite admirably compared to the conventionally grown potatoes. And so this is harvest, which you'll all be keen to see, I'm sure. This is a trailed harvester. Sorry, that's a bit loud. Because at the end of the day, I wanted to see whether it would work at a commercial scale, if we were to ever do this. You can see the straws, the trailed harvester taking the potatoes and the straw and some of the soil. And then you see what comes out the other end. Generally fairly clean potatoes, but we do get the odd bit of straw coming through. And what the potato harvester guy said to us is that you're giving me a 20-metre stretch to set up the machine. It's not going to happen that quickly. So this year we've gone slightly longer beds. We've got 50-metre beds this year to trial this with. But also he believes it would be better if we had used a self-propelled machine rather than a trailed machine with a much better cleaning system on it. And this is the sample in the back of the harvester, minus the big straw swath that went up. And this was the yields. This is only from yield digs, so 2 metre square yield digs. We had a number of different trials on the go as well. We had the potatoes under straw. When you multiply it up, just shy of 50 tonne a hectare. You had the plough, which was plough and plant. You had the plough, bed form and plant. Plough, bed form, bed till and plant, and then we ran the destoner through on the heath as well. So not a huge drop-off in yield, not as big a drop-off in yield as I was expecting, considering that straw didn't receive any seedbed nitrogen either. So promising results, and which is why we took it forward for the next year as well. Also interesting was that we had a look at the percentage of disease on the tubers as well, and the big standout one was the lack of common scab on the potatoes under straw, which was really interesting. I think that's probably something to do with keeping the potatoes moist for a continuous period of time. But this is something we need to investigate further, and hoping what we're going to hope to do this year as well. So this is where we are this year. We've got 3 beds now, 50 metres long. We've got one under just straw, one with digestate. We've got a lot of digestate across the farm, a couple of 1,000 tonne, and why not use that organic material where we can? So we've got digestate in the middle, and then on the far right-hand side, we have potatoes under straw with nitrogen. And they've only just started to emerge currently. And I should say, these were all planted, as you can see here. We started to use the potato planter rather than planting these by hand, but just moving the potatoes in a bit to get them covered with straw. And then to bring it back to the soils, we had a look at the soil aggregate size at planting, as this may have an impact on the ease of harvest in a couple of months' time. And you can see where they have the potatoes under straw, you have a much greater proportion of a much more even distribution of the soil aggregate sizes. And then when you see destoning, you have a much greater proportion of very fine soil particles and aggregate sizes. And you see that as we increase the number of cultivations, you see that there's a greater proportion of those smaller aggregate sizes. And we'll see whether that remains when we come to harvest in a couple of months' time, and whether that has an impact on harvesting. And so what does it look like today? I took these before I came out, travelled down from Lincolnshire. You can see on the far left-hand side there, that's the potatoes under straw. Quite still very uneven emergence when you compare that to the right-hand side, which is the potatoes grown, which is just plough, bed form and plant. So there's a huge difference in the evenness of emergence. The potatoes planted conventionally, very even, 100% emergence as of probably last week, whereas potatoes under straw were probably only at 10 or 15% emergence so far. Potatoes grown under digestate, probably a little bit further behind the straw in terms of emergence, but also we've got a lot of mushrooms as well that are grown from that digestate. And so that's where we are now, and what we're doing with trialling potatoes under straw and seeing what we can learn from it to how we might grow potatoes elsewhere across the business, and also having a look at cultivations more widely, because a lot of our potatoes might receive a plough, a cover crop, bed form, bed till, possibly twice, destoning operation if it needs it, and then planting the potatoes. But if we can just reduce 1 or 2 of those cultivations, then that has a benefit too, as well as going the whole way and doing potatoes under straw. So we've still got a fair bit to go until we manage to twist the farm manager's arm and say, can I have a tram-lined trial with potatoes under straw, and we'll harvest it through the DeWolf and straw it down with something like a carrot straw. So we've got a while to go, but the good thing at working at Dyson Farms is you get to have a play and have a look at these things and see what we can learn from it and implement elsewhere across the business. So that's the end of my presentation. I'll hand over to the next speaker.
Okay, thank you, Tom. So I'm going to hand over to Ben now, who's going to give his perspective on it, and then we'll have Edward.
Yeah, I haven't done a slide. It was a big night last night, and I'm struggling. Okay. Yes, I'm a consultant, but actually, first and foremost, I'm actually a farmer, and we grow potatoes. And when we went on a regenerative journey, the first thing I was going to give up is growing potatoes until my wife bet me that I couldn't grow a regenerative potato, which is like a red ragdoll bull. So I've now spent the rest of my life actually trying to find out how we could grow a regenerative potato. We spent a few years playing with straw, and we even got to the stage where we were actually crimping rye, applying by machine rows of compost, planting the potatoes on top of the compost, putting the ticker tape then on top of that, and then coming up with a carrot straw and strawing down on top of that to see if we could commercially grow 50 acres of potatoes. we did it enough to know that we lost so much money that we couldn't carry on doing it. And the challenge then became a little bit of, are we looking at this from the wrong angle? I'm probably just about to upset nearly everybody at Groundswell by saying perhaps cultivations aren't as bad as we all consider them to be. And I often refer what we do to nature. We talk about biomimicry and copying what nature does. And actually, if you ever see what nature does to regenerate itself, it's generally flood, famine, fire, or massive hoof impact. So in actual fact, is cultivations as bad as it can be? And perhaps we also need to also appreciate that if we are farming annual crops and therefore looking for a fungal bacteria ratio of 1:1, why on earth are we trying to drive it 3, 4, 5, 6 and the ratio to a point where we're going to end up with woody weeds and perennial weeds? It becomes a real issue. So to me, I've sort of changed the tact in which we look at how we grow potatoes in so much as could this be the fire famine regeneration part of my farm rotation. So what do we do? Normally bar potatoes follow a spring crop the previous year, so we put a massive biomass overwinter cover crop, and we graze them with sheep, sympathetically, shall I say, in so much as we graze them the first, where we take 70% of the growth, and then just before we plant the potatoes, we take the rest of the 30% off. No glyphosate is used, and then we do what we call a single powered pass. We have a machine, bed tiller with a planter on it, and that goes straight into the cover crop, and essentially it's one powered machine that goes straight into the cover crop, and out the back of the cover crop becomes planted potatoes. Doesn't sound that regenerative, but at the point of planting, we're using Johnson Sioux extract. So what we actually do is focus massively on the fact that if we are going to upset the biological balance of our soil, then let's cheat and put some back. And of course, by growing your own indigenous microorganisms, you can put your own organisms back into the soil. And interesting enough, when you start packing soils with biology rather than emptying them and creating vacuums, funny enough, PCN and all other things, rhizoctonias, seem to actually be held at bay. And that's something that's really quite important when we actually start thinking about how we can replace life with death. So essentially what we're doing is overcrowding our soils with biology. Another thing we do is actually plant our potatoes with companion crops. This was a real challenge for me, and it took us about 3 to 4 years to work out how to do it, and then I realised Brendan Rocky had been doing it for 10 years. And for those that have seen Brendan Rocky's work, it's pretty awesome. I just didn't come across him early enough, so I had to work it all out for myself. But what we realised is we're planting buckwheat, peas and vetch at the point of the tuber planting, so at the depth of 8 inches. Funny enough, it does grow absolutely fine. And they come out the top of the ridges, which means we can use a ridger rather than any herbicide, so we're herbicide-free and nematicide-free. So that's a good start to making things work rather quite well. The use of, obviously, vetch, buckwheat and peas. I live in the Wye Valley, and we have a huge problem with phosphate. We've got stacks of phosphate in our soil. It's very hard to get it to work for potato crops. So in actual fact, what we do is make acidification of the rhizosphere around the potato. So as you can imagine, both the legumes and buckwheat do a huge effect on acidifying that rhizosphere. Interesting enough, it also helps massively with skin finish because of the aid of scab control. So we get a double whammy of acidifying the rhizosphere, solubilizing more phosphate. We've got Johnson Sioux extract that's also bringing phosphate to the party. And funny enough, we're actually starting to mine these huge amounts of phosphate that unfortunately are ending up in the Wye. Of course, using peas and vetch, we're fixing huge amounts of nitrogen too. And when you add up the amount of nitrogen that we fixed in the cover crop previously, and then you put in your vetch and peas, what we're finding is nitrogen requirement, we're down to 10 kilos a hectare of foliar applied nitrogen. We use a urea sulfur mixed with some carbon and some humates to actually try and mimic as much as we can amino nitrogen. So that's the main point of planting. Interesting enough, having all of these companion crops also have pre-nectarase nectar. So essentially, they actually leak out a load of nectar from their stems very early. If you ever notice when you walk through a flowering crop that's not flowering, there's a lot of beneficials already there. plants have an amazing ability of actually leaking out nectar to start building those numbers up before the flowers. So basically what they're doing is getting all of their pollinators in before they go to flower. So they're building those numbers up. And funny enough, ladybirds is one of the huge things that come in on the back of that. So we have lacewings and hoverflies and all sorts of things that have a huge effect on aphid populations too. So we're rather quite thrilled with the way we grow them. We used to grow a huge amount of potatoes with potassium deficiencies. Used to use potassium chloride or muriate of potash until we realized on a sand, as soon as you start adding anything with a salt, essentially makes things twice as bad. And funny enough, the need for irrigation increases. So in actual fact, by doing away with potassiums in the chloride form and using either sulfates or polysulfate, funny enough, the crop doesn't get half as thirsty either. So that's rather quite useful too. So the irrigation requirement is massively reduced because of the way we're actually feeding the plant. Where have I got to? Sorry, it was a big night. So we're growing a potato crop, aren't we? Yeah. We then do what we call sap analysis. Are people familiar with Nova crop control and doing saps? There's a few nods, and I know there's people that definitely do it because I do it with them. So we do sap analysis, and sap analysis is one of these things that unlocks a huge amount of understanding into plant health. And it's really quite critical that in actual fact on our own soils at home, our biggest response, bearing in mind our soils are oozing magnesium, but the magnesium is causing us massive problems. So in actual fact, bitter salts becomes our best friend. Foliar applications of bitter salts gave far more response to the applications of phosphate, potash, and nitrogen. So in actual fact, most crops that you think are deficient in something are often more deficient in something else, and that generally causes most of the problems. We work on actually trying to manage excesses rather than deficiencies. So that's what we do there. In terms of insect control, funny enough, we haven't sprayed an insecticide for 3 years now on our potato crops. We're rather proud of that. There's a number of reasons for that. We do lift in August, end of August, last week of August. That's so we can get a decent cover crop in after, but it's also so that we can reduce massively blight pressures. Blight seems to come, certainly in our area, end of August, beginning of September, so we try and get away with... Last year we got away with no blight spray. This year we're not going to be so lucky, I'm sure. But we're really trying to manage crop health in order to resist as much as we possibly can blight. And then at the point of harvest, we use a self-propelled machine, park all the trailers on the headlands, do what we possibly can to lighten the load, and immediate plant rather quite as bigger cover crop. And if you're planting it in August, has a huge effect. We're working with various people and things. And last year we did carbon measurements. We're doing carbon measurements all the way through our rotation. Time up. I'll sit down. But I'll just finish that carbon measurement thing. For the first time, we actually noticed there was no decline in our regen potatoes in terms of carbon. That's 1 year, one trial. We're repeating it again this year, and we'll see how we get on.
Okay, thank you, Ben. So we've just had a quick debate, Edward and I, and I'm going to explain what we do, or what we've done at Groundswell, and the sort of history behind the trial, the no-till potato trial here. So I'm just going to run through that, and then Edward will follow us. So I'm here representing Groundswell Agronomy, but also Groundswell and chairing. So several years ago, I had the opportunity to go to America and visit several farms, and one of the farms that we went to was the Burleigh County Soil Reserve, and we were looking around, and they had a small trial there which was growing potatoes under lucerne straw, and I thought that was a really interesting idea, and that's really as far as it went. And I came back, and it wasn't until several years afterwards I thought, I wonder what we can do with that. So just a little bit about the sort of, I guess, the philosophy around the way that we approach the trial is quite important, because so for me, the main thing is these kind of 4 key principles: to optimize the return on investment, make sure that the system is resilient, reliable, and repeatable. So it's not really about complicating things, and I'm not trying to say that we're geniuses or what we're doing. But the fundamental thing really is actually sometimes I think we try and overcomplicate systems. So it's going back to first principles and taking inspiration from nature and making the system work for us, and the system being the solution. And at the same time as thinking about the no-till potatoes, I came across a book by Victoria Sweet, and she wrote a book called God's Hotel, and it's about the concept of slow medicine. And actually, one of the lines in the book is inefficiency more efficient than efficient? So our perception of efficiency sometimes, I think, is a bit skewed. So one of the other things, it's always important to start with why are we doing things? And that was really what drove me to start thinking about how are we going to do this trial. And also, after I came back, it was 2015. So it was International Year of Soils, and I thought, wouldn't it be great, because I'm very idealistic, if we could give every MP a bag of no-till potato crisps to raise awareness of soil health. Everyone knows, as farmers, the benefits of soil health, but when you start talking to consumers or MPs, it can seem like a very far-removed concept. And what I wanted to do as well, just before I get into the detail of what we actually did, I just wanted to put this question to everyone. Actually, what is the most sustainable carbohydrate source that we can grow? And back in November last year, I went to an event where the whole menu was based around squash. And actually, if you really start to think about carbohydrate sources, squash suddenly become a really interesting part of the conversation. So as I say, back in 2015, we did this trial for the first time. So you can see this was taken quite late on in the season, and you can see there on the left, there's a bed of potatoes. And so we're growing those in 4 rows under wheat straw. And then you can see on the right, when you part the straw, just prior to harvest, you can see how the potatoes form on the surface. One of the main things for me was to answer the question, how do we improve soils that have been degraded very quickly? And one of the key things is to bring large quantities of organic matter onto the farm. And how do we do that economically? And also thinking about, could we actually move the fertility around the farm? So take straw grown elsewhere in the rotation and use that on areas that need improving. And also by growing a high-value cash crop, we then make that more economic. And so, like I say, I was inspired by Jay Feurer. So if anyone hasn't come across him, I would recommend looking up some of his videos on YouTube. And he has been at Groundswell and spoken before. But he was the sort of inspiration and the work that he was doing at Burleigh County. And so you can see this is how we planted the potatoes the first time. And we had an overwintered cover, which we then placed the tubers on the surface after spreading FYM, utilising child labour that was available at the time. And we used round bale straw that was available on the farm. And the biggest challenge when you want to do a no-till potato trial is if you approach a potato grower and say, would you like to do a no potato trial? They look at you as if you're completely mad, almost as mad as when you approach Grimmy and say, would you be interested in helping with harvesting no-till potatoes? But we're really working and we're moving forward, and I'm really pleased to say that hopefully we'll be working with them on how we can mechanise the harvest. And you can see, so this is a bit further on after the potatoes have been planted, and the dog is for scale, but you can see on the left the tuber just starting to sprout there. And then again, one of the things with being quite idealistic, we wanted to try and grow the potatoes without irrigation, without fertilizer, and also could we actually make it work using bacteria and fungi. So we've worked with PlantWorks and we've used mycorrhizal fungi, and you can see around the rest of the field we grew some spring oats. So they're just sort of showing a bit further on in the season with the tuber starting to form on the surface, and then sort of you can see there the bed where we did do the mycorrhizal fungi. Actually, I don't think it was benefiting the potatoes. I think it was actually just the inaccuracies in the dung spreading. And as I've said, the main thing was to sort of eliminate all the sort of main things that would normally be used for potatoes, just to see how far we could go and get proof of concept. And this is just an example of the tuber size. These were all harvested by hand because we weren't lucky enough to have a potato harvester locally. and you can see the sheer amount of residue that's left on the surface. One of the key things really is no-till potatoes have potential as a crop in themselves, but then it's thinking about how does that affect the rotation. And one of the key things was how do you leave that residue there but carry on the rotation. So the idea was that after that we would then plant a wide row crop. In this situation we did sweet corn and we also did squashes as a way of growing a high-value crop after the straw, but leaving the straw in the rows to continue to break down, so that then after the harvest of the squash, we would then plant a cereal crop. The other advantage with leaving the straw on the surface is that, particularly when you're growing squash, there's a commercial value in keeping the skins clean, so rather than having to wash the squash, the squash are actually forming on the straw. And the other thing really was actually, while we want to improve the organic matter, the main thing was to try and get a biologically active soil. And just some results. So these are unreplicated. So this is the untreated plot with no mycorrhizal inoculant. We're yielding 40 tonnes a hectare. This was in 2015, and that was with a full fungicide program, and that was done using 5 square metre trial plots. And you can see the treated doing slightly better, but as I say, I think that's more down to the variability of the manure that was used. And then the key thing that we found, we were harvesting in mid-October, and the biggest challenge I would say to no-till potatoes are mice and slugs. And my job when we were harvesting was QC and just making sure the quality was right, and I was picking out mice, immature mice, and slug-damaged potatoes. So the biggest challenge I would say is that, but also because of that, it's then looking at what is the market that we're actually growing for. So possibly seed or salad potatoes would be a way of lifting earlier and managing that issue. And then, like I say, this sort of systems approach. So you can see here, we replicated the trial again in 2019, and I don't know if anyone was here in 2019, but hopefully you would have enjoyed a bag of crisps made from potatoes in that particular year. So we worked with Fairfield Crisps, and we were able to make those potatoes that we harvested in 2018 into crisps. And you can see here, this is just sort of demonstrating that systems approach and just sort of food for thought, really, that taking the Three Sisters principle, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, can we actually utilize high-value crops and grow them under the mulch? So that's sort of a quick roundup of what we did here at Groundswell. And I don't know if anyone's been up to look at the no-till potatoes that we have on site this year. So they're just on the demo field above the compost. If you have, that's the trial that was a success. So we had 2 sites here that we put potatoes in this year. And unfortunately, the second site, we were using up some waste straw, and mice were more of a problem actually when we planted the potatoes than when we... I don't think we'll be harvesting those, but these have literally only just come through in the last 10 days. So we're keeping our fingers crossed that these will continue to grow successfully, and we'll be able to actually see if we can fully mechanise the harvesting at the end of the season. So I'm going to hand over to Edward now to give his opinion as an agronomist on the potential of no-till potatoes and some of the issues and some of the solutions.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Edward Bradley. I farm North Cambridgeshire and near the Lincolnshire border, and we have a small family farm. We are growing potatoes, only about 75 acres, on 3 different farms. There is some nice silt in that area of the world, and traditionally potatoes have been a big crop in that area of the country. We don't all have irrigation. The water is too saline, so the potential for change is difficult, because the farmers that are already growing the potatoes, how do you sort of influence change? Well, on our own farm, we stopped ploughing. We've been doing no-till since 2007. So we have an improvement in the soil. And probably about 2014, on our skirt land, so on my particular farm, we were asked to grow 10 acres of potatoes. Father-in-law had some seed left. He said, well, have you got some land that we can put it on? I said, yeah, I think there's one side of one field which is a bit siltier, and I think in the past, probably 40 years ago, we grew some potatoes. So he wanted to get it ploughed quickly, and I didn't. So we had this debate. I'd improved the soil, in my opinion, and I didn't want him to basically mess up what I believed the way forward to be. So we didn't plough it. We just worked it in the spring when it was at the right moisture level, so we didn't do any damage of compaction or anything. So we cultivated, didn't go overly deep, just enough to cover the potatoes, and planted this field of agria. In my father-in-law's terms, we were barking up the wrong tree. And we carried on through the season, and really nothing was any different to the normal. They grew very well. I was fully expecting I was using up those years of no-till, building up the organic matter and cashing it in for potatoes. So it's easy as a farmer not to grow potatoes and to have them from somewhere else on your kitchen table. But do we have an obligation to grow some sustainable food with vitamin C, vitamin B6, potassium and manganese? A baked potato has about 9.6 milligrams of vitamin C. So the humble potato is an important food source, especially with food security in today's world. So carrying on from Richard's thoughts, being regenerative with your soils, it can open up a lot of probably not traditional potato land to grow potatoes on. Things like the preparation after a cereal. Wireworm are a problem, and slugs. We are in the dry east part of the country, so, like I said, we've got no irrigation. But I think Ben's really, fantastic what he's doing. But to do what Richard's doing with less, hardly any soil movement at all, it brings its own problems. So on the trial, just over here, we've got straw covering the seed, and there are possibilities that if you had organic matter like compost, you could add compost to the ground before you planted. And of course, where do you start? After harvest, probably of an arable situation, you take the combine and you, in my opinion, take the straw off. You may have slug problems, you may not. But essentially, if you grow a cover crop, let's say after winter barley, you could grow the actual cover for the potatoes. So in this instance at Groundswell, we've got straw, but we could actually grow our own cover. So you would grow a mixture of cover crop varieties, and then you would mow that, move it to one side, put your compost on, plant your potatoes, and then cover it back up again. The whole thing with the potatoes in that scenario, they have to push through to gain the light. So it mustn't be too thick, otherwise you stop them coming through in a fashion to achieve a crop. But you could add straw afterwards, like the straw shredders that we use for cattle yards, and you just add straw as they grow. That's a bit like healing up the soil as years gone by when farmers used to harrow them down, and as soon as they got up, you healed them up. So that's what I was suggesting with the straw. Salad potatoes are probably the favourite because they're early lifting. Pests can't get to them quite so readily. And obviously if you've got flour-rich margins or, you know, a companion, perhaps, like Ben has been telling us all about. So, as a practical point of view, it's difficult to do a no-till, but it is possible. I think one of the nicest things would be to have like a pick your own, and then you can have a strip on your open farm Sunday, and all the children can come and rootle under the straw and pull the potatoes. But it's an interesting concept that needs more work. Thank you.
Thank you, Edward. So before we open it up for questions, I just wondered if anyone else in the room has had experience of growing potatoes in a regenerative system and whether they wanted to make any comments about how they've made it work or problems and issues they've had and how they've approached it. I don't know how many of you here are... Yes? Just wait for the microphone. Lady here.
I've grown them for the last couple of years just on a small scale in hay. We had a load of 100 big rectangular bales of hay which were going rotten. So I did them in windrows, and very similar to how you've done it in straw. Really easy to harvest. And this last time I've harvested long grass with a specific machine we've got, left it in a windrow over winter, and then planted them in the spring, and then earthed them up with excess that I had. And I've just taken my first harvest, and they've worked really well, disease-free, and I'm going to do it on a bigger scale this year. And I've mown, because I wanted strips of wildflowers in between. So it works quite well, because what do you do with the long grass? Because when you harvest the wildflowers, it's no good for hay, because it's too old. So I thought I'd compost it, and then I thought, well, rather than lugging it to the windrow at the top of the farm, just do it in situ. And I've also trialled it in agroforestry strips as well. So it acts as a mulch for the trees. So instead of doing it in the alleys, I have the wildflowers in the alleys, and then I have the strips of potatoes in between the trees.
Thank you very much. I don't know if anyone else has got any experience or comments. So before we open it up to questions, I just wanted to ask our three panellists what issues they think there are around marketing and how they can be addressed. Do you want to make a comment, Tom?
I think for us it'd be looking at direct marketing of those potatoes and how we could build a customer base from direct marketing regenerative potatoes. But I think everyone's idea of what regenerative is slightly different when it comes to potatoes, because I think we'd still end up with possibly some cultivations or tillage. We'd most likely be using cover crops, but whatever we did would need to be done at scale, and it would be mechanised harvest and mechanised planting as well. So there's practicalities that we'll need to solve first, but we probably wouldn't go down a pick-your-own sort of route. It would be commercially harvested and packed and processed by ourselves if it was to ever take off in a big way. But I think for us it's a bit of a learning curve. That's the ultimate way, that's the ultimate place to get to, perhaps, or the most extreme version from what we're doing now. But I think there's lots we can learn in the middle for our commercial potato growing business along the way with reduced cultivations or reducing our reliance on water or fungicides and blight sprays. And perhaps I think there's an opportunity as well for potato breeders and looking at different varieties that are less reliant on inputs as another big part of this, not just what we do on the farm.
Yes. So, we don't have, obviously, quite the problem of harvest. However, this year we've planted 9 different varieties altogether. If diversity is something that we're all aspiring to, and we know it works with wheat, barley, every other crop we seem to plant, what we've done this year is taking processing potatoes, like I said, in various different trials, but between 7 and 9 different varieties, mixed them all up and planted them. That creates its own problems, whether we actually try and sort them out or whether we actually just use them straight into the processing as that. Or in actual fact, what we are wondering is, can we actually print up bags, sell them in supermarkets, so if we took it to a processing and actually explain to the consumer that the red potato does this and the cara will do this and your white potato does this, so you essentially can actually have your pick your own free range. One thing we also do at home is eggs. And we've noticed the consumer absolutely loves the fact that we have white eggs and blue eggs and speckled eggs and all that sort of thing. And we just wonder whether the consumer might actually quite enjoy having the diversity in a bag of potatoes to actually make their own choice whether they're going to boil, chip, mash or whatever. So it's something we're just playing with at the moment.
Edward, would you like to comment?
I think from what we've seen in the last couple of years, probably local is best. So I'd like to see more small farmers, market gardeners, and less miles on the road, really. Just like this guy here. When you speak after this chap, it's a bit difficult. Well, your concept, I think is pretty damn good. So.
That's all you need to know.
I must admit, I was 10 minutes before this asked to join the stage. So, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Edward, for coming in at short notice. So one question I posed to the audience was, what is the most sustainable carbohydrate source? And I just thought before we opened the floor up to questions, I just wondered if our panellists have got any thoughts or comments around that.
No.
Okay, well. Okay, so I'd like to open the floor up to questions. So if we start at the back here on the right. If you just wait for the microphone.
Hi there, thanks for that. I just wanted to ask Ben, I mean, you mentioned on 9 different types of potatoes. In the Andes, Quechua farmers, they plant like 400 types of potatoes. Would you ever go down that route and look at loads of different tubers as well?
Yeah, so some of the trials we're looking at is actually, we planted some ancient varieties as well and got them back right back as far as we can. I firmly believe that potatoes historically would have had mycorrhizal associations, pretty good ones at that. So we're actually just trying to see and measure. It's rather quite hard. I've got a field, it's 10 hectares, and we've got about 600 trials in it this year, because every time I seem to come up with another wacky idea. Unfortunately, it's another load of what 3-word points. And it gets to the point where it runs away, and some guys have come and had a look. It gets rather quite tricky, but absolutely. So our wheat, we started with mixing 3, and then we mixed 23, and now we're 297, and that seems to work quite well. So in actual fact, I don't think there's a reason not to expand on that sort of thing. Of course, we're planting 1 hectare of mixed varieties this year. I still need to sell them. Margins are where they are. So, yeah, I'd love to have a go at doing a few more, definitely.
Okay, any more questions? There's 2 here in the alley. If we could, we'll start with the gentleman with the cap.
Hi, I'm just sort of thinking sort of directionally as opposed to sort of absolutism. I mean, for the vast majority of commercial potato farmers who grow on scale, and aren't that many in this country, what we're talking about here is actually quite extreme and sort of seems a long way off. But what I'd be interested from the panellists would be if they were going to say if there's a couple of things a commercial scale potato farmer could be doing, could change and do right now, what would it be?
Do you want to go first, Tom?
Yeah, I think what we're looking at across our businesses is we're looking at cover crops where we can, as I think most people are, but also when within the rotation we're undertaking cultivation and the type of cultivation. We are still across the majority of our potato area all still is ploughed and has bed tilling processes and bed forming, but I think where we'd probably like to get to is, do we need to do 2 passes with a bed till, or do we need to do even 1 pass with a bed till? And that's why it's interesting looking at the progression of the cultivation trials that we have, where we have been grown under straw, those that are just plough, bed form and plant, and those that see the bed form, bed tiller, de-stoner if it needs it, and looking at the differences in yield from those comparisons. And as the graph shows, there's not a lot of difference in yield when it comes to taking out 1 cultivation. It becomes then about quality and ease of harvest. So from a commercial point of view, we're looking at number of passes and also the type of passes. We've had a look at running a leg down the middle of a bed to see the effect that has on water infiltration, and that's something we're looking to measure going forward. So at a commercial scale, it's the type and the number of cultivation passes that we're using. I think if the potatoes under straw has got legs commercially, I think we'd still be reliant on some cultivation just to soften up that top surface, top 10 centimetres or so, because if we start ripping off the shares on the potato harvesters, I won't be very popular with the engineering teams that are continually replacing shares from trying to dig potatoes out and just trying to get under that potato to lift it, I think. So that's the progression we'll see from a commercial point of view. And a straw, well, not commercial, but a trial point of view is next year probably disking in the cover crop and then planting on that, but it will still have had earth moved down to around 10 centimetres or so, I'd expect. And I think something for the breed, looking at the varieties available, blight-resistant varieties, I think there's a potential there, but that's probably not something for us in this room to solve. It's the plant breeders and how we can reduce reliance on blight sprays and also water.
Hey, Ben, did you want to?
Yeah, mine would be fairly simple. Focus on life rather than death, and work on the principle that actually, if you keep creating these vacuums, you're going to end up with problems. So in actual fact, one of the simplest things and one of the low-hanging fruits for me is actually every time you think about ramming something in, like a nematicide or a blight or a herbicide or anything with a side in it that's going to kill, is there an opportunity to actually put something in that would actually give life and make your own compost? This whole movement, and the reason we're all sat here today is to take back control a little bit of your farm. We're very good at innovating. Unfortunately, I've just come from a talk where I did about mental health, and I think half the reason a lot of us have these mental health problems is we're really good at actually coming up with problem solving to lots of problems. And when you get given a prescription for pretty much every way you farm, funny enough, your problem solving skills disappear. We're not very good at following recipes. I mean, we're very individual. We'd all like to think as farmers we're a little bit odd. I certainly am. And therefore, in actual fact, let's start challenging ourselves to why we're doing something and make that actually quite an enjoyable thing. I've got this problem, rather than just reach for that can. Why have I got this problem? How are we going to overcome this problem? In actual fact, we've got some absolutely amazing farmers that come up with some incredible solutions. And I think that's the big thing for me, is actually start, get away from the prescriptions, get away from lists, and actually start using the thing we're very blessed for. So problem solving.
Okay, and Edward?
Yes, all of the above from the other two guys here, and basically widen the rotation, improve the soils in between, less cultivation, create diversity, graze the cover crops, use less fertiliser.
Okay, thank you. We have another question just here?
Thank you. My concern by doing the regenerative production of potatoes in the season is you potentially make the potato production less efficient and less yield per hectare, which if the potato demand remains the same, means we need to do more potato planting. Is it possible we can produce the potatoes in a refined way that we're doing now with some of the suggestions that you've made, but then do the regenerative bit immediately after the potatoes have been there to repair the damage? So we do the potato cropping efficiently and the soil regeneration efficiently, maintaining the yield and not requiring more land to be planted to what potentially could be quite a damaging crop. I've tried to think whether that would work, and we're trying it on some farms, but I just wondered what the panel thought about that as a potential solution, with one of the issues being a lot of potatoes are grown on land that's not owned by the person growing the potatoes, which is an added complication.
Okay, do you want to... I'll go, Ben?
Yeah. I pretty much think you've just summed up what I'm doing. So we're not no-till potatoes. We're doing a small amount of damage. We're trying to repair the damage whilst growing them too. And it's not that complicated. We're using the old Amistar applicator to put our Johnson Sioux extract in, and we're using the Holstein that used to put mocap in for planting our companions. It's nothing different than what we're doing. We lift, as I said, towards the end of August, which means we can repair the damage really quickly and get in there, and generally not doing it in massive wet conditions. And yields for us, and this is why we went back to cultivations from the straw idea, is our yields are comparable with the conventional. We're still growing some conventional just to see and track and see where we're getting to, but we're finding that in actual fact you can refine it, have the same yield, and correct any damage well as well. So yeah.
Okay, Tom, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I think it's true for all the crops. I think while we're aiming to be less intensive, I think one of the key things is certainly at Dyson Farms is looking to maintain or increase yield where we can, but farm less intensively, less diesel, less hours, less intense cultivations. But the key thing for us is maintaining yields, and that's something we always measure and look at across all of our trials for whatever crop, and that won't change.
And Edwards.
The only thing which early lifting means is you've got to have some sort of cooling for the storage. So, you've got to have some sort of either wind generation or way of making some electric to run your compressors. Because if you lift early, you'll have warm potatoes to keep cool or to get cold.
I think the other thing, which is quite interesting, and from the benchmarking that we've done, the focus is very often on yield, and actually looking at diversity is a key part of the system. So having opportunities to diversify and stretch the rotation and also access more land that otherwise might not necessarily be as suitable for potatoes or considered suitable for potatoes, then it changes the dynamics around the economics. And I think it's then working through those numbers in a different way. Okay, there's two more questions at the back.
Ben, all the way from South Africa. You had a big night last night. After 6 good nights, do you not think that you'd be ready for another big night? I think the analogy being that is it such a bad thing that you disturb the soil once in so many years? We have found in South Africa, in no-till and minimum till, that I'm talking now row crops, predominantly maize, sunflowers, soybeans, that after about 8 years, in actual fact, the performance of those crops start going down. And generally, the farmers have realized that they need to work that soil again for various reasons. I believe that microbes are incredibly resilient. If you are tending to them for a period of time, in other words, no-till or minimum till, then they will recover pretty quickly if you then follow a tillage effort. So I think, to summarize then, is it such a bad thing to every now and again work a soil?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I think it's really strange that we continually chase this fungal-dominated soil. The only fungal-dominated soil I know is generally growing trees. I'm trying to grow annual crops. And this absolute obsession with making it fungal-dominated is something I really struggle with. Because in actual fact, we know, and it's well researched, that most of our annual crops and brassicas or even cereals. Cereals are a little bit more fungal, but certainly our brassicas, our potatoes, those sort of things are very much one-to-one. And therefore, why on earth are we trying to aspire to 6, 7, 8, 12, and that sort of thing? So I totally agree. I'm passionate about no-till between our potatoes. It's really important we repair and heal. But what I don't believe is that actually it's the absolute ultimate of not doing anything forever. If we are trying to do biomimicry and copy nature, and therefore just left a plot of ground to do what it was going to do and do no tillage, funny enough, we end up with a forest.
Okay, Tom, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I was going to say I agree with the gentleman that I think certainly that's their outlook at Dyson, is that, you know, the opportunities we have with the rotation between potatoes is really important for us to be able to look after the soils there, reduce cultivations, no-till where we can. We're not no-till everywhere, it depends on the crop and the soil type, of which we have a huge variation across the farm. So, but we know once we get to potatoes, we might take 1 or 2 steps backwards in terms of soil health, but actually, you know, the years in between that, we've got ample opportunity with cover crops, reduced disturbance, return of organic manures, to really build up the soil health there. And then once we get the potatoes, they get the soil in the best condition we can when we get the potatoes, which is a high-value crop for us, and accept that it will be damaged slightly, but we've got the chance to repair it in the following years.
Okay.
Well, as a spring crop, you've got the opportunity to grow a lot of biomass between harvest from a previous crop and planting your potatoes. So there's guys in France who are planting after cultivation to kill wireworm. They're planting their cover crop on the prepared bed. Then they flail that into a green manure and incorporate that into the seed bed. So you have got ahead of the game, as it were, with a bit of organic manure before you plant the potato. And I agree, there is, there's no need to worry too much about destroying the health of the soil, only in the short term.
Okay, so we're coming up to an end of our session, but we'll take one last question, and I believe it was at the back there.
Thank you very much. I've got a question for Ben. What was your cover crop after your harvest?
After the potatoes or pre-potatoes?
No, well, pre and after then.
So we generally stick with Ademir Caligari's ideas of making sure you have the 5 groups of legume, brassica, cereal grass, and chenopod. So there will definitely be all those 5 species in it. Over winter, obviously, we put more winter hardy plants in there. We know we're going to graze them with sheep, so it's essential we definitely put in plants that sheep won't eat. This is slightly strange, but in actual fact, of course, if we're trying to protect soil, then for obvious reasons, put in things that are unpalatable. Phacelia and linseed are really important in anything you're going to graze, so that A, the sheep trample it, and B, when the sheep move on, that Phacelia and linseed actually continue that living route, actually pump back up and start and carry on with that carbon pump. So one thing's really important when we bring livestock into rotations, which we have, is to focus more on what they're not going to eat rather than what they're going to eat. But so it's about a 15-way mix, and it's probably a bit of a way to go through it here and now. But it's lots of diversity, lots of biomass, but as a focus on grazing and non-grazing plants.
Very much. Do you grow alouette potatoes as well? Alouette.
Alouette?
Yeah?
Don't even know what you're talking about.
Well, it's a potato variety,
Okay.
very blight resistant for Magrico.
Okay, no, not yet.
No, you should try it. It's really good.
Sounds like a plan. Have you got any?
Yeah, plenty.
Awesome.
Okay, we'll bring it to a close now. Thank you very much for coming, and if you could show your appreciation to the speakers.